Good afternoon and welcome to our monthly insight. Today we've got with us Mr. David Beliles. He and his wife Ruth are residents, of course, here at Plymouth Harbor. Signed up in 2009 and moved in 2010. And we're going to find out all about David and some of the wonderful things that he's done in his career. It's quite impressive when I went in. David?
Thanks, Barry. I haven't done this for a while, so I hope you will bear with me. And I didn't do this on purpose to get your sympathy, but it does remind me. I was just walking into our apartment this morning carrying a package, and I hit that lever, that knob, and broke something or did something. And the good folks at Liz's department fixed me up. So I'm here even though I'm wounded. My wife, Ruth, can't be here for a number of reasons. She has a number of physical problems and a mental problem. But I did bring a little picture so that she's here with me. This is Ruth about 30 years ago. The reason I have this is my daughter and son-in-law gave Ruth a birthday party for her 80th birthday several years ago, and they had made up a number of these posters and had them placed around their home of different phases and ages of her life. And this is when she was, I think, mid-50s, when we were both mid-50s, in our height of our power, I guess you might say. So I want to tell you about her first, because she's so important to me. She's my better angel, has always been for 64 years. Ruth grew up in a lower middle class home, as I did. Her father was an enlisted man at the University of Illinois. He was with the ROTC, the mounted cavalry there. And so she was born in the middle of the Depression, as I was. And so that's why I have the Depression hook to start with. But she, to tell you a little bit about her, she, from her 9th grade through her senior year in high school, she got 1 B. That doesn't mean she got all the rest C's and D's. All the rest of her grades were A's. And so when she graduated from high school, she was her valedictorian of her high school. Not only that, she grew up in the hometown of the University of Illinois, Urbana, Illinois, and she won a 4-year full-ride scholarship because of her scholastic ability to the University of Illinois, graduated from there in 4 years. So Ruth was a reporter when I first met her. She was, later in her life, a copy editor and a proofreader on newspapers. She was a high school teacher when both of our children were headed for college in order that we didn't have to borrow money. She took a $6,500 a year job as a full-time English teacher in high school, if you can believe it, in the 70s. And so we did avoid borrowing money for our kids, and they got through college. Then after we became empty nesters, she got graduate work done, both at Wichita State University and at Truman State University, and became a college teacher at University of Nebraska at Kearney. She taught freshman English as an adjunct professor for about 9 years. So I'm making the case for Ruth, of course, for my Ruth, that you know who she is when you see her. She doesn't get out much. And for all the women, I think there are a lot of women in this place who are residents who maybe don't show it now, but who were accomplished people in their lives, who did something with their lives. Ruth is just one of them. So I'm speaking for a lot of women. I know you all know that, but I'm just reminding you and myself that when we see maybe a little old lady, we don't see everything about her. and you won't see everything about Ruth. And so I'm reminding us all that there are a lot of accomplished women here, and they may not show it now. So Ruth is looking over my shoulder. Well, I told you this was going to be about the Depression, but that was a lie. I know that you're all way too young to know anything about the Depression, but Ruth and I were born in the middle of it, and so we're Depression babies. And at that time, the unemployment rate, they think, because there were no accurate figures, was at least 25%. And in some areas of the country, like Harlem, was 50%. And so it was a desperate time, and a desperate time for people to fall in love and to think about having families. But Ruth's parents did that, and my parents did that. So we were born in 29 and 30, you know. And the birth rate, by the way, in that period went way down. And there was only one way to do it, and that was by abstinence in those days. So we're kind of unusual people, because a lot of people were not born who might have been born in that time because of that terrible Depression. You've all seen pictures, the gray pictures of gray men waiting in line for soup kitchens. There was no unemployment compensation. There was nothing. People were starving, literally. So that's how we started out. I told you about Ruth's family a little bit. Her father was an enlisted man with the ROTC at the university. My mother and father fell in love in 28 and got married in 29. I was born in 30. My father was a good student in high school, and he was enrolled in Jefferson College of Law when I was born. Now, that was not a fancy residential law school. In those days, they had law schools that were in downtown areas. Sometimes they had buildings, sometimes they didn't. This school did have a building, and he was attending there. But after I was born, he had to drop out of school in his second year. And what he did to keep his family together was sell insurance 25 cents a week, door to door. And at night, he worked in a box factory, making boxes for cigars. But he did that for 2 or 3 years, and then newspapers came to our rescue, because the Hearst people started up a newspaper in Louisville, Kentucky, against the established and well-entrenched Louisville Courier-Journal and Times, morning, evening, and Sunday. And so the Hearst people started up an evening paper, and my dad got a job as a district circulation manager. And that's how we started our relationship with newspapers. It must have been about 32, 33. One of my first memories was of him and his station, which was a garage on an alley. And the carrier boys, and they were all boys in those days, 11 to 13 years old, just about, would come in after school, and their bundles would be delivered by truck earlier. And there were benches around the perimeter of this garage. This is my dad's office. And the boys would come in and fold their papers and put them in their bags, and they'd all start out in different directions to cover their routes. My dad eventually became, after the Hearst paper went under, he went to the Omaha Bee News and worked there for 2 or 3 years, and we lived there, and the newspaper went under. And then we went to Chicago, Illinois, and my dad worked for one of the newspapers there until it went out in a vicious strike, and we had to leave town in the middle of the night. My dad's brothers came and picked us up in the middle of the night, and we left because he was in mid-management, and management was riding around in cars 6 at a time with baseball bats. It was that type of bad thing. Then we went to Cincinnati, Ohio, and my dad worked for the Cincinnati Enquirer for about 6 years during the war years. He was a little too old and had 3 children, so he didn't get drafted. He was 1A at the last, but he didn't get drafted. And so we finished he finished his newspaper career at the Cincinnati Enquirer, and then joined a newspaper promotion company where he was sales manager, where he was involved with major newspapers of the country. But we were lower middle class, as I mentioned before. Ruth's schooling, you've heard about. My schooling was a little more start and stop, mostly stop, because I dropped out of school in my senior year in high school. And here's the exciting way it happened. In Louisville at that time, there were 3 boys' high schools and 3 girls' high schools. And there were no neighborhood schools then. You chose the school you wanted to go to. I chose a school that was supposed to be college preparatory. And so we were on a streetcar going to school, my 2 friends and I, and one of them said, and we were drifting, we were cutting school, we were in trouble with the law, we never did anything unlawful, but we were cutting school and not doing well. And one of the fellows said, David Powers, said, you know, instead of going to school today, let's go join the Marine Corps. And so the other 2 dumb guys, including myself, said, oh, okay. So we went to the Marine Corps recruiting station and joined the Marines. I'm bringing up the Marines because that's one of the major influences in my life. The Marine Corps wouldn't take kids like that these days, I don't think, but they took us then, they were desperate. And so we were lucky enough to get a 1-year active enlistment of active duty and then 6 years of inactive reserve. And so I made it. Some people didn't. Out of a company of maybe 80 people when we started, we lost about 15% from mental hardships and physical disciplines. But anyhow, I made it. I was never in the lead in those marches or in the athletic activities, but I withstood the mental assaults and the physical problems and made it as a Marine. You know, you don't get to wear the emblem of a Marine, a sandy nose, until you get through boot camp, and then you're awarded the Globe Eagle Anchor of the Corps. That's when you become a Marine. And so the Marine did more for me than I realized at the time, because when I got out after that 1 year of active service, I decided I had to get in college, and I was not going back to high school. My parents had moved to Chicago, Illinois, and so I took tests at several colleges and universities that allowed you to get in by testing in, and I got in. And so I was in for a year and a half in college, and then the Korean War started. And so I was in the inactive reserve, and so I was called in back in October of 1950 in the Marine Corps, and got out again in May of 1952. But the Marine Corps did a lot for me that I didn't realize at the time. It made me realize I could do some things. I had a very low ego or personal esteem before the Marine Corps, and it made me kind of a bad guy. And that it made me realize that I could do some things that before I didn't realize I could do it. And so it changed my life in a lot of ways, positive ways, and so I owe the Marine Corps a lot. And so I am both a member of the 1st Marine Division, I'm a life member of the 1st Marine Division Association, and I'm also a life member of the 2nd Marine Division Association. And I have to be a life member of the 2nd Marine Division Association because my only grandson, Ruth, and my only grandson is now a captain of Marines in Special Forces, Marine Corps, and he's in Iraq, and he has 3 weeks left to go. So we're sweating that out a little bit. And now the newspapers. I started in newspapers after I thought I wanted to be a broadcaster. In fact, I majored in broadcasting in college, and one of my jobs in colleges was the Midnight Flyer. WEDC in Chicago. This is the Midnight Flyer. I was on from midnight to 6, 5 nights a week, going to school in the daytime. The reason I got the job is because one of our professors was also general manager of WEDC in Chicago. And so he thought I had a nighttime voice. And in those days, that was important. And so I spun records and did a 5-minute news broadcast at the top of the hour for 6 hours until my health broke, or I thought I was going to go crazy doing all those things. And so I want to tell you and confess to you that after a while, I couldn't do it anymore, and I left school. So I had neither a high school diploma nor a college degree. All my friends think I do, but I'm confessing to you that I do not. Ruth has 2.5, so I figured, she's going to share that with me. So I started in the newspapers because my job at the WEDC, and I worked also at ABC Television Network, not the station in Chicago, but the network. I was in the continuity department, management training. That meant I used the big electronic mimeograph machines to make the scripts for Super Circus. None of you remember that, I know, but that was ABC's big show in those days. But then I went to the newspapers. My father got me the job, frankly, because he knew a lot of publishers. And so I started at the Urbana Courier and the circulation department as a district manager. And about the second day I was there, there was a stairway up to the second floor. And the second floor was divided. The front part was the newsroom, about 35 people in the newsroom, and then circulation promotion, about 15 people in the smaller department. And I walked up that stairway and looked to the right, and there in the newsroom, it must have been around deadline time, because almost all the people there were there, and there was one woman in that whole newsroom at the time. There was another woman, her boss was not there, but Ruth was there. And I want to tell you, I was struck, because there were all these ugly guys, and they were all smoking, in those days, this is 1952. 3. They were all smoking, I swear. I think every one of them were smoking, and some of them were smoking pipes or cigars, and there was just this blue haze, and they were pounding those Royal typewriters and Underwood typewriters, and there was this one beautiful young lady sitting there by herself, and I know every man in that newsroom was in love with her. And that's when I decided, what the Marine Corps does to you. I decided I was going to see her, and I did, and we eventually got married. But I wish you could have seen the picture that I saw of her that first time, because she was lovely. From there, I had an offer to be the news director in the radio station, the biggest radio station in Champaign-Urbana. The same day, I got an offer from another newspaper that was slightly bigger and a little better chance. And I had to make a decision in 24 hours whether I was going to go and broadcast or whether I was going to go and stay in newspapers. And I made the decision to go with the newspaper. And we went to Independence, Missouri. And we were there for 8 years. And the best thing about that is that I worked for our man who was an alcoholic. He was the publisher of our paper, and he had a lot of problems with alcohol. But I told him my dream. I told him I wanted to run a small daily newspaper. I wanted to be a country newspaper man like William Allen White. Have anyone ever heard of William Allen White? I didn't think so. But William Allen White in the early 1900s, 1920s, 1930s, was a national figure. He was publisher of the Emporia, Kansas Gazette. And he was famous because he was such a wonderful writer that his columns and his editorials were picked up and carried by the New York papers, the Washington, D.C. papers, and papers all over the country. And he was instrumental in Republican politics and in electing William Harrison over, who was it? Oh, Bryant from Nebraska. William Jennings Bryant. So William Allen White was a great man, and I tried to mold myself in his image. I didn't make it, but. So after independence, I was going to say my publisher allowed me to work in every department because I told him what my dream was. And even though he had problems himself, he let me work in advertising, he let me work in news, he let me work in the composing department, he let me work even in the press room and the stereotyping department. This was in the days when newspapers were all using hot metal. And so I thought I was prepared to be a publisher and editor after 8 years of doing that. But I finally got my chance in May of 1961 in York, Nebraska, and went to York, Nebraska as editor and publisher of that small daily newspaper. What I wasn't prepared for, I thought I was prepared, but what I wasn't prepared for was the amount of expectation there was for an editor and publisher of a small paper. I covered the city hall as a reporter. I covered the city council as a reporter. I covered the school board and the schools as a reporter. I carried 8 advertising accounts as an advertising person. I signed the payroll, did the payroll, wrote every editorial every day. There was an editorial to write every day, and thank God none of those are in existence. I tried to make sure that all those have been burned because I never want to see how I was writing in those days, because it must have been pretty bad. When I would see the paper at night, when I would get home and open the paper and see what I had written as an editorial, I go, oh my God. That's really humbling. I want to tell you a couple little vignettes about newspaper editing in a small city. As I told you, I covered the school board, so I knew the school board members. And they had a piece of land right out of downtown and part of a park, and the community did not have an indoor swimming pool. We did not have a indoor basketball court or squash course or handball course, and we needed a community center that had all those things. And so I started a campaign to editorially to have the school board give that land to the city so that we could raise money and build a community center to have all those things. Well, we got it done. But in the process, I was sitting in my office one day. We had 3,500 square feet was our total newspaper. Everything was in there. It was a storefront in downtown York, Nebraska. And here comes the chairman of the school board. The guy is about 6'5", probably about 270. Harry Dahlgren, I'll never forget his name. I hope he's dead now. But he came into my little office, and my office was right by the front plate glass windows, just Venetian blinds between me and the sidewalk. And Harry walked in, he said, I have a mind to pick you up and throw you out that window. And I stood up, see, the Marine Corps made me bad. And I stood up and I said, well, Harry, I think probably you can do that. But I tell you what, you're not going alone, and I'm not going alone. And so we started to talk after that, and I got over it. The other thing I want to tell you about York, Nebraska was November 22nd, 1963. I went home for lunch because I didn't do that often, but we only lived about 6 blocks up East Hill. There is a hill in Nebraska, not many, but there are a few. And I'd gone home for lunch, and I think someone called me from the office and said that the president had been shot. And so I ran back down the street and got in the office. Our managing editor at the time, newspaper titles are confusing even to newspaper people, but I was editor and publisher, so I was the top guy. But the departments had department heads, and the news department, what little it was about 5 or 6 people, including me, was run by Tom Burke. Great guy, had been in the job for many years. And he was sitting calmly at his desk. And I ran in there all out of breath. And I said, Tom, did you know the president? Oh, he said, I know that. I said, well, have you remade the front, at least remade the front page? No, it's past our deadline. I said, Tom, for God's sakes, the president's been shot. He hadn't been declared dead yet. I said, we've got to remake page 1 and the jump page. And he had this pica pole. You don't know what that is. That's, in those days, we measured picas and points in newspapers. And he had this pica pole that he always measured everything with. And he threw that across the newsroom. He was really upset. And so we went back in the composing room, and there was page 1 all locked up. It was past his deadline. You know, he'd been doing this for 30-some years. He was 30-some years older than I was. And there was this thing all made up sitting on a turtle, we call it. And we rolled that over to the hell box and dumped that whole damn thing in the hell box to go to the remelt furnace and started making over. And this is, you know, a little newspaper in the middle of Nebraska, 6,000 circulation, but I didn't want the day the president was shot and killed, that someday some student, someplace at the Nebraska Journalism School, I hope, wanted to look up the Nebraska News-Times, the York News-Times on November 22nd, 1963, and see that there wasn't a damn thing in there about the President of the United States being shot. But that just shows you how we can all get in such a rut when we're doing our daily jobs that sometimes when we should do something else, when we should react, when we should be flexible, we're in this rut, we're going to stay in it. And that was Tom. He's a wonderful guy. The next day he came up to me while no one was looking and said, you were right and I was wrong. So that was, and we got the news in that day. From there I built a new plant there and switched the newspaper from hot metal, which we were all using, all newspapers, and we're the first newspaper in that whole area of the country to go offset. So I built a special plant, found out about the offset process, which was basically a photographic process, built a new plant, switched the newspaper, and for the first time, by the way, I forgot to tell you, I was working for Stauffer Communications. I worked almost my entire career, 40 years, for Stauffer Communications. And because I was the first newspaper to go offset and build a new plant, I became the immediate expert for our company of 21 daily newspapers throughout the upper Midwest. And so I was moved. The next move was to the founder's home newspaper, the one he founded first, in Arkansas City, Kansas. Now, you've probably never heard of the Arkansas City Daily Traveler, but it was an important newspaper to us because it was the newspaper our founder started in May of 1930. And he had gone on to Topeka where he was running the Topeka paper. But anyhow, I was sent there, and it was an old building, and I had to build a new plant and switch the newspaper to offset, and I did that to 2 or 3 other papers. Next was the Hannibal Courier Post in Hannibal, Missouri. My good friends call it the Curious Pest, not the Courier Post. And then there was Grand Island, Nebraska, where I ended my career. And for the last 18 years of my career, I was made vice president of newspaper operations for our company. And so I had a number of newspapers over the country that reported to me and to which I had to travel once or twice a year. Places like Holland, Michigan, Hillsdale, Michigan, Colorado, Indiana, Missouri, Kansas, of course, and Oklahoma. That's where our newspapers were located. So I finished my career there in 93 because I knew our company was going to be sold, and they brought in an outsider to change it. Because all of our newspapers, our founder never said our editorial policy was this or that. We had Democrats, we had liberals, we had conservatives. By the way, I'm a conservative. You may not have known that, but I am a conservative. And my liberal son, the retired college professor, calls me his favorite conservative bozo. So, anyhow, after I retired, I found the newspaper was going to be sold, the newspaper company was going to be sold, and so I retired early because I was sitting in a convention one day in Omaha, Nebraska, in the ballroom of the paper, at the ballroom of the biggest hotel there, and they were reading the nominations for the master editor publisher of Nebraska. And they started reading one, and about halfway through, I realized that they were talking about me, because the letter nominating me, one of the letters nominating me, said, at that particular time, at that moment, I had trained 12 people, 1 woman, and 11 men who were, at that time, publishers of daily newspapers in the United States. I had never counted them, but anyhow, I realized that I was going to get the award. But what I'm trying to leave with you is that if you have a dream, if you're in your dream job now, God, are you lucky? I'm not talking to you, but if you have a dream beyond where you are, you need to tell someone, and hopefully you'll be able to tell someone like Hall Collinson, my first publisher, who facilitated my dream by letting me learn the newspaper business. Now, once you have someone that's going to let you train like that and pushes you like that, you have to perform once you get there. But if you have a dream, tell somebody about it who can help you. And then after you've worked your dream, then you start helping others, because there's nothing more gratifying in the world to have realized at that moment, I didn't even realize it, that I had all those people all over the Middle West and most parts of the country who were running daily newspapers that I had personally trained at my newspaper. And the reason, I guess, they sent these people to me from around the country and around other newspapers, that I had such a love of newspapering. I told you it was 11 men and 1 woman at that time were running daily newspapers, because our company president at the time sent me out because he told us at a meeting of publishers one day, he looked around and they were all men. All the officers and all the publishers were all men. Must have been early 80s. And he said, men, we need to find a woman. And I thought of this person that I had trained, she was right out of journalism school at the University of Nebraska, worked for us for 2 years and went back to law school, became a lawyer, and was practicing law in a different town in Nebraska. And I called her, and she said, yes, I would consider it. And so she came, and I trained her, and she became a publisher of our Hillsdale, Michigan paper. And ever since then, she's remembered my birthday. I just had a birthday, 87. So I got this card from her and a letter. She's coming to see me Sunday. Whenever she's in the state of Florida, and she has family, I think, in Ocala, she rents a car and drives down and has lunch with me. And so she sent me this card. Happy birthday to you, master editor, publisher, mentor to the last of the newspaper publishers, before a resurgence in a few years. Because I know what's happened to newspapers, and it's hit me in the heart. Because newspapers have lost half of what they had. And some of it is self-inflicted, in my opinion, because they've lost track of the idea that in news you report objectively. And in the editorial page you have your opinion, and people should respect it as long as you are willing to respect theirs. But newspapers have gotten away from that. And so I think part of this is self-inflicted. The other big thing, of course, is the internet, and that a lot of people think they're getting their news, but they're not grazing for news. Because when you read a newspaper, I do it every day, I may not be looking for something in particular. I may be interested more in sports because of the Rays or something, but I will come across at least one or two news stories that I wasn't looking for because I was grazing, and it was important that I find it and see it, and I wasn't looking for it. But in the internet, so much of it is opinion and not marked as opinion, and you don't get the grazing for news that you do with the newspaper. Anyhow, that I wanted to leave you with that. To, if you've got a dream, tell somebody, and if you make your dream and live your dream, help somebody else, because nothing will make you happier than that. Have I gone over my time?
We're gonna. While you were talking over here, Ruth whispered to me she wants to be on the other side.
Okay.
Look at you while we go through, see if anyone has any. I said, okay. She said she wanted to look at you.
I think she's always done that. She gives me that look and straightens me out.
See if anybody has any questions or comments. Or anybody.
Look, oh God, I got so much here that I didn't give you.
What a wonderful life you had. Amazing.
Well, thank you. It was a wonderful life.
And Chris?
What did your parents say when you went home and said you joined the Marines?
My mother cried. My father was non-committal because he was the good student of our family, and he knew that at the time, I wasn't going anywhere. I was not going to graduate with my class because I was falling way behind. I was cutting school. I couldn't blame my parents. They were trying to do their best. But I don't know what it was, whether it was moving around when I was a youngster to all those cities that I named, but it was my fault. But my dad was not that upset. And he saw that when I came back after a year of active duty that I was a little different person. And we had a reunion of sorts with each other. And unfortunately, he died at 50 years old with multiple myeloma, the same thing that killed Walt Mattson. By the way, when I heard that Walt Mattson was moving here, despite myself, I got a little defensive. And Ruth, told me, you shouldn't feel that way. But I thought, big guy like that, biggest newspaper in the country, or was at one time, and here I'm a little country newspaper guy. And when I met him, and we sat down and had lunch together several times, I realized that he was so easy to talk to and so easy to get along, and we had so much in common. He was a Marine, by the way. And by the way, here are some Marine cliches for you, since you're not asking questions. Once a Marine, always a Marine. I'll be an ex-Marine when they put my ashes in a box and put it in the columbarium at All Angels Church on Longboat Key. Then I'll be an ex-Marine. I'm a Marine now, 87 years old. Sandy knows this. Her son is a damn good Marine, a career Marine.
What was your MOS?
I was a 60 millimeter mortar gunner, and the best one in the battalion.
Not everyone probably is aware of your relationship with the Observers.
Yeah, I didn't even get to the Observers. In '95, my son-in-law, Matt Walsh, was a better newspaper man than I. I told my daughter when she was growing up, for God's sakes, do not marry a newspaper man. Do not marry a newspaper man. You see that I work 7 days a week. I have no money, and it's a acerbic job many times, and many people. She wrote a theme once for, I don't know if it was high school or college, starting out that we start the dinner conversation by my father said, well, the Baptists are after me again. And I loved the Baptists. My grandparents were Baptists, but that was true. I did say that at one time. But anyhow, I was going to retire because the company was going to be sold, and I was going crazy. And our son-in-law, Matt Walsh, who had worked for our company for a while as editor of a couple of our smaller dailies, and then decided he wanted to be big time, and he went to the Miami Herald and became assistant business manager, and then he went to the St. Pete Times and ran their magazines and ran their business pages, and then he became Southeastern editor for Forbes magazine, and they wanted him to move to Manhattan, and he looked at Manhattan and looked at where they'd have to live and decided they loved Florida. He was working for the St. Pete Times at the time before he went to Forbes, and so he started looking for a weekly newspaper to buy. And he found through a newspaper broker that the Longboat Observer was for sale. And so he started negotiating with the then owners and founders of the Longboat Observer, Harry and Claire Hunter. And eventually he got it done. And so he called me. We had just sold our house in Grand Island, moved to our vacation house in Colorado that day, when he called and said, well, the negotiations are done and you've got to come down and help me run the paper. And I got on the plane the next day and left Ruth and with the living room full of boxes where they had to walk through an aisle like this. And so I was gone for about 6 weeks before she joined me down here. But then my son-in-law is a very aggressive guy. The first thing he started after 2 or 3 years of running a Longboat Observer, we started, it was called the Gulf Coast Observer, Business Observer at first, but it's now called the Business Observer. During the recession, you know, we only sell advertising. We do not charge anything except for this paper I'm holding up. We don't charge anything for it, and so advertising is our only income, and our advertising in the depth of the recession, because our number one category in advertising is real estate, went down 47% in about a year. And you know what happened? We'd been supporting this lousy business journal with thousands of dollars a month, and Miami offered us $1.25 million for it. And I said, sell that son of a gun. But I was outvoted.
Really?
And thank God, because when we started losing money in our newspapers, because in a year's time we lost 47% of the volume, this thing took off because it was a legal publication. And somebody's got to publish all those bankruptcies and all those foreclosures. And we started publishing. And this thing, then, during the depth of the recession, what kept us in business with our newspapers. So thank God I was outvoted. I wanted to show you a couple of the new things that we got. This is our newest acquisition. It's a daily record in Jacksonville, and it's the only daily we have, and as you can see, it's a very small daily, and it is mostly a legal publication in Jacksonville. That just came online a couple weeks ago. We bought the West Orange Times about 2 years ago, and that's going pretty well. Windermere is brand new. That's within the last couple of months. And Winter Park, Maitland is also. We also own newspapers in Palm Coast, on the East Coast, Ormond Beach, Plant City, and the 4 newspapers in the Sarasota area. That's Longboat, Sarasota, Siesta Key, and East County, Lakewood Ranch. Any questions?
So you're still working?
I'm still working. Well, I'm chairman of the board.
Wow.
That means you're about to be kicked out completely. You know, I used to pride myself, because I got all this training, on being very familiar with newspapers. I can walk in our main office at Main Street and 31, and I do that once or twice a year, whether I need to or not. And I cannot tell you what they're doing, because what they're doing is so foreign to me from what we did when I was in the newspaper business, that I'm at sea.
Mr. Blau, I have one
Yes.
question. When you were in Nebraska, did you know Joe Berkeley in Kansas?
No. I knew about him, and we became great friends here. Joe was a special friend,
Yeah.
but I got to know him at church first before we moved here. In fact, it was our church, All Angels, and the number of people who lived at Plymouth Harbor who went to All Angels, that influenced our decision on where we wanted to move. Jack Dennison, Nancy and Buzz Gross, and it was Joe Berkeley and Nancy, and who else? I'm forgetting someone. But anyhow, that helped our decision a lot. Well, you've been very kind, and I've talked too long. Oh, I forgot to show you our Slick magazine.